Please welcome Nathan Myhrvold, founder and CEO, Intellectual Ventures, primary author, Modernist Cuisine books.
So I want to talk a little bit about technology and the future of food. Of course, there's a huge anti-technology element to a lot of modern thinking about food because technology has been associated with bad food, food that isn't good for you. I'm going to try to make the case that, in fact, technology is an important component of anything we do going forward. So I'm working on a book on bread right now, and you can't talk about bread without talking about wheat. And wheat is an example of the ultimate commodity food. Wheat is bought and sold by the ton. And our entire system of growing, marketing, using wheat has been focused on one thing, on cost. And it's actually worked. You get wheat is cheap as dirt. In fact, actually cheaper in some ways. They don't subsidize dirt. But when you only optimize for cost, what you get is optimized cost without necessarily optimized quality. And in a broader sense, wheat is sort of the most extreme case of what we've done to all aspects of our food system. So the wheat market is kind of interesting. 160,000 farmers farm 63 million acres, and pretty much they have 5 products. Almost 96% of all wheat is the big 4. It's hard and soft, winter, and spring. Bread is made of the last one. And then that goes to really 27 big flour companies, but the top 3 are half of all of the flour. Now then that finally goes to lots of commercial bakeries, lots of retail bakeries, it goes to your grocery store. The thing that is awkward about this is that there isn't any grades of wheat. There isn't much ability for someone to say, well, I make a better wheat. No, you make one of those 4. And you get paid a ridiculously low amount for it. So here is we got some government statistics on the per loaf breakdown of a cost of supermarket white bread. We won't go through all of the points. Here's all of the different things, and at the bottom, farm. The farmer gets 5 cents. That is the lowest thing on there. Advertising is about the same. Insurance is about 8 cents. Now, have you ever picked up a loaf of bread and said, God, there's so much wholesome liability coverage here? I mean, this is just like, that's why you're buying it. Wheat is almost free. And unfortunately, you get what you pay for. You get a product that's standardized and really, really cheap, but it doesn't necessarily do anything else for you. And of course, if you look at an artisanal loaf of bread, it's pretty much the same equation. The artisanal loaf will cost more, but the farmer's typically only getting 5 cents. A few artisanal bakers will work specifically with a wheat farmer, and those guys might get 8 or 10 cents. Now, in the rest of food, we've learned about the idea of farm to table. So if you want really good crab, if you're on the East Coast, what you do is you call this woman Ingrid, and Ingrid will connect you directly with the crab fishers in Maine, and you get very fresh peaky-toe crab. And every great chef has got a set of ways of directly procuring things like that. If you want wine, do the winemakers of the world go and buy generic grapes? No, they grow the grapes themselves. In every other aspect of food, one of the essential ingredients, if you will, is a direct connection, as direct as possible, between the people who are growing the food and then the people who are producing it or eating it. That's the only way to get quality. If you have a one-size-fits-all market, you get a one-size-fits-all product. Now that's very difficult in something like grain because the system has been built up over such a very long period of time. Fortunately, there's a lot of ways in which this movement is started to erode in markets other than grain. So if you look at farmers markets, there's 8,200 farmers markets in the United States, up 75% since 2008. I wanted to get some statistics on this. I couldn't get like the really hard statistics, but I am pretty certain there are more farmers markets in the United States today than there were in 1900. Now, of course, our population is a lot bigger, so it's not really fair. But that's okay. I'm just making a gee-whiz statistic. It doesn't have to be fair. The thing is, we actually have better access to the ingredients from a farm now than most Americans have had in several generations. And over time, I think that we're going to see that increase. Whole Foods is an example of a large-scale supermarket that is trying to move in that direction. Between the direct consumer things, chefs who are building networks, and others, for produce, for fish, basically for expensive stuff, it works great. And over time, I think technology is going to allow us to connect even better. These are just two examples of sites where you can directly connect with farmers, sometimes on a subscription basis where you promise the farmer a long-term revenue scheme. Sometimes it's direct. I'm sure that Jeff Bezos will be flying drones with your artisanal vegetables in your window every time you check. I think for most ingredients that are both expensive and are ingredients that really stand on their own, so things that people will really love by themselves, we're actually in reasonably good shape. But to really do this for the food system broadly, we have to change our outlook. In particular, you have to be able to restructure the commodities market so the things aren't a commodity. Beef is an example of something that has been a commodity in some sense, yet even beef had very early on a series of grades. And now when you buy it, you also care about whether it's grass-fed and the breeds of cows, and all of that has gone on, not so much in grain or in bread. And you have to pay farmers more. The idea that in a loaf of bread that the farmer gets 5 cents is kind of ridiculous. Now, the reason, by the way, that we made grain so cheap wasn't for eating bread. If bread eating was the only reason to make it cheap, we probably wouldn't have invented all of the technology that went into making it cheap. We made grain cheap so we could feed it to animals and eat the animals. So grain-fed chickens and pigs and cows, you need to have grain really, really cheap to be able to afford to feed it to those animals, go through, raise yourself up on the food chain and have meat, which I love. I love meat. I'm not being anti-meat there, but if we're going to change the way we eat, particularly with the stuff we eat ourselves, we should stop eating the feed we developed for animals and start eating feed we developed for us. So I've gone over that. Here's a great example. This is a new variety of wheat called Edison wheat. Edison wheat was created by a couple of people, including Steve Jones here. He runs a research facility called the Bread Lab north of Seattle. And Steve is breeding wheat to taste good, and to taste good in very specific contexts. But the thing I like to emphasize here is it's the bread lab. It isn't the bread shed. It isn't the bread, things were better in the 19th century. Because it turns out that if you really want to make the best wheat you can, it really helps to have a lab. It helps to use all of the tools of science, not to make things cheaper, not to make things more industrialized, but to make them better. And you totally can use all of those tools of technology to make things better. You just typically, over the last several decades, the only people who invested the time and the energy and the money into using technology were big food companies or government research that was done effectively at the behest of big food companies. Now, I'm not a big food company hater. But when you have a situation where the only people who use technology are the people trying to make stuff dirt cheap and whatever sells the lowest common denominator, you're not going to get the result you want. At the same time, going back to the past isn't that great an answer either. So in our bread book, we work on a lot of ancient wheats. And our joke is that there's a reason ancient grains are ancient. They all have some problem. They don't make great bread, for example. And you can use them, but boy, sure, if you want the low fluffy, you better use some real wheat at some point. Or you go through lots of techniques to try to ameliorate that. We love many of those things because they have unique flavors and textures. But I think Steve and people like Steve are going to create a lot more interesting things using science. And that comes to an interesting point. People love variety. We have a greater variety of food available to us today than at any point in human history. There are more different types of cuisines, more products, and I think going forward, that's only going to increase. Now, historically, there's been a couple sources of variety. One is that we import stuff. So we didn't used to have sushi in the United States. Sushi came in, great, we've got sushi. There's also really creative new things that happen when people do cross-cultural stuff or just come up with really good ideas. And finally, there's technology. You may not think about it as much, but ice cream was really made a mass market food only when we could have refrigerators. And wine and chocolate and coffee and lots of other things have a tremendously large technology component. I was talking to a friend who said that they hated fast food, and I said, well, what do you think about espresso? He said, well, I love espresso. I said, well, what does the word mean in Italian? In fact, espresso was invented in 1901 by an Italian inventor who filed a patent. He wanted to make super fast coffee. It turned out it makes delicious coffee too, but it's an example of a technical innovation. But here's the thing. This idea of importing food, which was so good to us for so long, we're done. Okay? There aren't any more. Now, of course, there'll be a few other cuisines around the world that maybe you can't find in Manhattan. But if you think about sushi, sushi is this culinary gem where these people in Japan worked for 300 years perfecting it and developing styles. And so when we inherited sushi, this was like finding a huge literature or some enormous amount of music or some other tremendous cultural thing. And guess what? There's no other thing as big and well-developed as sushi out there for us to find, because otherwise we would have found it and brought it to Manhattan already. So what are we going to do? And I think the answer is we're going to have to really rely on two things, which is creativity and technology. I think those are the things that are going to create the foods of the future to increasingly feed our demand for variety. And I love the last panel, and I love all of the things that they're doing, but I don't think anyone's going to eat at any one of those restaurants all day, every day. We all like to have a variety, so it's fabulous that there's a Mimi Chang's and a Sweet Green and a Dig In and a variety of other places like that, but that won't stop you wanting Thai food. So there's a lot of interesting examples where the high end of cuisine has directly influenced the way everybody eats. Here's my favorite one. In 1987, roughly, two very high-end chefs, Jean-Georges van Grichten, who at the time was cooking at a restaurant called Lafayette in New York City, and Michel Bras at his 3-star Michelin restaurant, both invented a liquid center chocolate cake. And today, you can find this in your grocer's freezer, as they like to say in ads. Everywhere on earth, there's liquid center chocolate cakes. Now, why did it take high-end chefs to come up with it? I don't know. But if you look at kale, if you wonder why we went our whole lives without adding salt to caramel and now we can't not add salt to caramel. Those are all things that came from the creativity of chefs, that are really applying their genius to this. And, lunch was a great example. Can you believe the garbage they served us? And it's a terrific example because in the hands of Dan Barber and his team, the garbage was delicious. And so the idea that you need to have creativity and the chef's creativity, I think, is absolutely part of what we need going forward. Because it turns out we can talk all day long about what's good for you and what you ought to eat, and that doesn't make any difference at all. If it doesn't taste good, no one's going to eat it. Of course, the farm-to-table movement is another thing that was championed by high-end chefs. I've just chosen two here. There's many, but Dan Barber, obviously, here at Stone Barns, has been an enormous proponent. David Kinch at Manresa in California. And tons of other chefs have, starting very early, have built this into an enormous movement. I don't think you could have a Dig Inn or a Sweet Green if there wasn't farm-to-table being pioneered at a very high end. Ethnic cuisines adaptations are also there. There's a terrific documentary, The Search for General Tso, which is interesting because there's a whole subtext to the world of ethnic food that values authenticity. But what the Search for General Tso documentary shows is that it's a combination of authentic and completely unauthentic things, which we call creativity, by the way. That Chinese chefs came to America and the cuisine of both places changed. And I think it's a great example of how ethnic cuisine will adapt. And here's one from Seattle, Tokyo Dog, genuine Shibuya-style hot dogs. Now, I've been in Shibuya recently, and there's precious few Tokyo hot dogs in Tokyo. But in fact, someone got the idea of putting miso and bonito flakes and other stuff on a hot dog, and it actually tastes pretty good. Liquid nitrogen is a terrific example of a purely technological thing. First suggested for use in ice cream in 1901 by a woman named Agnes Marshall, who was sort of the Martha Stewart of her age. She wrote this series of cookbooks. She had a cooking school. Would have had a cable show, but didn't have cable then. And she wrote this book on ice cream where she said, hey, we could use liquid air, which is what was called back then, to make ice cream. Well, it turns out the first chef to actually ever do it was André Dogan, who is a very traditional French chef who had a 2-star Michelin restaurant in Gascony. And he started doing this in 1980. And when I told my friends like Ferran and Heston Blumenthal about this, they said, no, we did that first. But then I showed him an article that Gail Green wrote in New York Magazine in 1980 talking about it. So that was an example of something that was a culinary idea that almost happened. I mean, it was out there. Actually, Dogan served at a big dinner in New York in 1981. And it didn't catch on. Later, it caught on. But in the sushi business, that's how we get good sushi. All of these tuna here, this is the tuna auction at Tsukiji Market. Those tuna are all frozen with liquid nitrogen. And they're white because frost forms on the outside while they're doing the auction because they're so incredibly cold. That's a terrific example of something where a lot of technology goes into making sure that you get decent sushi. And then hopefully going forward, technology will go into a way to get you sushi that's maybe a little more sustainable so we don't drive tuna extinct, because I really like their bellies. Wine is another incredibly technological thing. Wine making, like bread making, is about microbiology, but it's a very precise kind of microbiology, and technology has dramatically improved the quality of wines that we have. There's great winemakers that don't use technology, but for the most part, understanding what you're doing is better than not. This is the latest area that technology is working in, which is to try to make meat replacements. And I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that either of these things taste like meat. I've tried them. But it's a huge issue for our planet that we all love eating meat, or not all of us, but the majority of people on planet Earth do. And all the folks that are too poor to eat lots of meat have this as a great aspiration. So a great question for us going forward is, can we satisfy some of people's cravings for meat with replacements? And to be honest, I'm of two minds on this. Every time people have tried this in the past, they've come up with something that's delicious and wonderful, but it doesn't replace meat, it becomes its own thing. The first artificial meat is called sausage. You take parts of the meat that are otherwise unedible, you take a bunch of fat that's otherwise unedible, you take some inedible intestines, and you say, hey, I can make the really tender, juicy, wonderful cut of meat that either didn't exist on the animal or there was not enough of it for all of us to get. But tofu is that thing. Cheese has been that thing, and tempeh, and tons of different foods were all created to try to make a meat substitute. And yet in each case, what we've done is not actually used it to substitute meat, we've turned it into a dish on its own right. And so it's a fascinating question. Will they get the science right to make stuff that really tastes like meat? And then, of course, there'll be people who say, but gee, is that right? Is that natural? Is that whatever? When another couple billion people in the world enter the middle class, and they all want cheeseburgers just like us, both the health implications to them, but also the implications to the rest of the planet in growing all that grain and animals and so forth are pretty daunting. So I think this is an area that it's hard to dismiss, even though the current examples aren't perfect. Coffee has always been a source of innovation. I want to highlight one specific one, that as wonderful as coffee is, it's got this problem. And the problem is that we drink coffee as the ground seed, but that seed came in a fruit called a coffee berry. And you macerate the coffee berry, and you take all of the pulp, and you make these huge mountains of it in all over Latin America and other places where they grow coffee. And then the runoff from that goes into the streams, and the fish get really jumpy. So what to do about this? Well, this is an example where my company got involved, and we created a new company, which we spun out, called Coffee Flour. So, hey, why don't we try to eat that stuff? And in fact, it's pretty good. You know, it takes something that's otherwise a waste product. It's got caffeine in it. It's got a very kind of a dark fruit taste. It's got a little bit of bitterness. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to do going forward, to say, how can we do something, how can we take something we were going to throw away and repurpose it? Like lunch, but whereas lunch was about things that are thrown away at one industrial scale, believe me, every cup of joe that everyone on earth drinks makes mountains of this stuff. In fact, that's our one problem with coffee flour. It's great, except we haven't found a way to eat it by the ton yet. This is like the famous cartoon, environmental cartoon, We've Met the Enemy, and it's us collectively. If people aren't willing to pay for better food, if they're not willing to go to slightly more effort, but on the other hand, if there aren't people willing to make it convenient, you know, it's wonderful to exhort people to cook from scratch. I love cooking, and I write ridiculously big cookbooks, so I'm totally into the idea that people should cook. But realistically, you know, my mom was a single mom, working 2 jobs really hard. Telling her to cook everything from scratch wouldn't have been a very practical suggestion. And she's not here, so I can say there might have been other downsides. I learned to cook for a reason. Anyway, You need to directly connect with farmers. When you break the connections, that's the advantage. That's what a commodity market is all about. But when you break that connection, with it you break any tie to saying, well, this one is better for this, and that's better for that. You need the direct connection, and I think technological innovations are going to help us there. You need to innovate for taste, and you need to leverage technology. Particularly in bread making, the area that I'm currently working, there's been a feeling for the last 20 years that the way to improve quality is to become more and more artisanal. And so, one guy says, well, I'm going to do this. The next guy says, well, I use wood for fuel. And the next guy says, oh, I grow my own grain. And the third guy is going to say, well, I grow the trees I use. And as great as some of that is, I think to really do things at a large scale, if we don't use technology, we're taking the best trick our society has, which is how to figure stuff out, how to innovate, how to create new companies and new business models. That's the best way we have out of the dilemma we have with our food system. That's it. Thank you.